Hello and welcome back to our feature match area. I'm Tim Willoughby, joined by Hall of Famer Luis Scott Vargas. Now, in the break between rounds, we got a chance to see a deck tech on what is one of my favorite decks at this Pro Tour, that being the Winding Constrictor aggro deck, and we're very fortunate to get a chance to see a little bit of it in action in the feature match area this round. A couple of different players running it. Let's see how Team Snake does as we head into round 6 here at Pro Tour Aether Revolt. Hello and welcome to this round 6 here at Pro Tour Aether Revolt. Our players are just getting ready to kick things off in the feature match area. And there we see Victor Fernando Silva. He is on the black-green Constrictor list, characterized by Winding Constrictor. We've seen a deck tech for it. We're going to see it in action, but he's up against a Pro Tour champion on one of the powerhouse teams at this Pro Tour. Team face-to-face games, Alexander Hayne, Mardu vehicles. It's a powerful combination, Luis.
Yeah, I would expect this matchup to be pretty fast. Like, we've seen a lot of fast matchups in the feature match area so far once it comes to standard, and I think this format is just characterized by a lot of proactive decks with both the Winding Constrictor deck and the Vehicles deck looking to just get ahead early and kind of push powerful synergies.
Silva there, we can see his hand. He's got a bit of action early on in terms of removal. It's going to be Tyler's Tracker or Walking Ballista, the first permanent, but a Traverse the Elvenwild gets to search up a land, so at least that side of his game, pretty straightforward. Evolving Wilds as well, also meaning that his mana base should be relatively easy. Also, he's a straightforward 2-color deck, and the same cannot be said for Alexander Hayne. Yeah,
like many of the Vehicles decks in this format, you know, they're Mardu vehicles because they are primarily Mardu, but they do splash blue. Spire Bluff Canal makes that a lot easier. Spire of Industry helps as well as Aether Hub. So I would expect most Mardu vehicles deck to be touching blue for cards like Metallic Rebuke.
Well, we'll get a chance to see how it is that Alexander Hayne wants to kick things off. That number 13 next to his name indicates that he is the 13th ranked player in the world right now. Of course, we would expect big changes to the rankings after this Pro Tour. Veteran Motorist, the first play from the Canadian, lets him scry 2, and it's a 3-1 dwarf body on the board that is very potent when it comes to crewing vehicles.
And Hayne had a kind of classic decision there where he has a 3rd land in hand, but no 4th land for that Gideon, yet he scried 2 lands to the bottom. The reasoning being, if he draws 2 lands in a row, that's much worse than just missing for a turn. So he's taking the I think, better long game approach by just putting those lands on the bottom.
Another copy of Traverse the Elvenwild there for Victor Fernando Silva. Sorting out his mana base, no Delirium just yet, but in principle later on in the game he might be able to use that to search up a key creature.
Yeah, and he's got Grim players as well that key off Delirium. So less heavy on Delirium than in previous iterations of the deck, partially because you don't have Emrakul, the Promised End, as the high end anymore. But Delirium is still something the deck strives for.
And we have actually got another black-green deck in the feature match area that's 5-0. Ben Rubin is playing black-green, and his is more of a Delirium list. Their Grasp of Darkness taking down the one threat from Alex Hayne. In spite of the fact that these are both quote-unquote aggro decks, the fact that there's a lot of removal, meaning that hard to get the first points of damage on the board.
And another feature of aggro decks in this format, especially the black-green ones, is they don't actually have any aggressive 1-drops, and they have lands that enter the battlefield tapped instead. So Victor can't really get on the board that early. He can start on 2, but it's a little slower than, you know, an aggro deck like Hayne's that has Toolcraft Exemplar and Thraben Inspector.
So another Veteran Motorist here. It looks like this decision for Scry a little bit trickier for Hayne than the first. There is a Toolcraft Exemplar in hand that at some point might get cast here. Basic Planes means that it can happen, but Thraben Inspector also an option here.
Yeah, and traditionally you're going to lead with Toolcraft Exemplar just because it attacks for more on the next turn if you end up playing an artifact, like Thraben Inspector, which comes with the clue, of course.
So there is a basic Swamp in hand here for Fernando Silva. He plays it, which means that 4 mana untapped and a 2-2 Walking Ballista. Now this is a card that does a lot in a large number of matchups. Here, it's just straightforwardly shooting down the 3-1 Veteran Motorist and hanging around to potentially grow and deal with more creatures later. But against Saheeli Rai, it can also do some good work. It's an on-board answer to quite a lot of things.
Yeah, and Victor does have the option right now to trade it straight up for Toolcraft Exemplar by removing the last counter, but he can wait to see what Hayne does. If Hayne doesn't play an artifact, maybe you just take the 1 and then next turn you can perhaps pump Walking Ballista or just not worry about Toolcraft Exemplar for now.
Well, it's just a 1-1 coming in, and that's the first point of damage in this game. It's taken a bit of time to come through, but there we have it, 19 life for Victor Fernando Silva. And you'll notice at the bottom of the screen we have an advantage bar. That's because we know that sometimes life totals alone don't really indicate who's in the lead. With Gideon coming into play for Alexander Hayne here, is that a bit of a shift for him ahead?
Gideon is a powerful play here, and you know, the fact that Alex does get to make a Knight token means that he's able to get ahead on board, but I don't think the advantage is firmly in his favor, just because Victor has a lot of ways to answer this. If he could hit 5th land for something like Virtuous Gearhulk, for example, that would be a pretty substantial swing. I would say the advantage is slightly in Alex's favor here.
Alrighty. Now, it looks like the pickup for Victor Fernando Silva this turn was Rishkar, Pima Renegade. That one of a lot of ways in his deck of putting +1/+1 counters on creatures. And if you're going to put +1/+1 counters on creatures, Walking Ballista, pretty much the gold standard of creatures to make bigger. Here, Rishkar pumping both of the team for Fernando Silva.
And that also allows Fernando to immediately tap the Walking Ballista for green mana if he so desires, and play like another Walking Ballista as a 1/1, and then set up a really good Virtuous Gearhulk turn next turn.
It looks like he's considering his options. That might be what we see here. Well, you called it. Lots of counters all around. Black-green counters a synergy that we see in Limited a little bit, but very potent in Constructed also.
Yeah, Winding Constrictor, Walking Ballista, Winding Constrictor, Rishkar, both combos are very, very effective. If you go turn 2 Winding Constrictor into turn 3 Rishkar, you're a huge favorite to win any game where that happens.
That's why we have the advantage bar. For now, though, the advantage still kind of just edged towards Alex Hayne, though. A good turn there for Fernando Silva. Thraben Inspector coming down. That brings a clue.
Yeah, what if I really like Thraben Inspector, so I move the advantage bar up?
Of course, clues, I guess, gain a little bit of extra utility given that they can be used as artifacts in play for various effects that have come with Aether Revolt. I guess that white doesn't have too many of them to work with?
Not as many new additions, but improvised cards like Metallic Rebuke are pretty impactful, and that's like one of the cards that the Mardu decks tend to touch blue for. So we're seeing something here which we don't normally see, which is Gideon wasn't activated before combat because Hayne wanted to see how Walking Ballista was used. So you normally see a pre-combat Planeswalker activations, especially in the face of other creatures, but Hayne wants to see how Victor Fernando Silva handles this turn first.
Well, I like this Unlicensed Disintegration now. Not only is there an artifact in play, but without Rishkar in play, now there's no mana available for Victor Fernando Silva with those Walking Ballistas.
I'll make another.
So Hayne currently ahead, but if Victor draws on a 5th land and can play a Virtuous Gearhulk, that is a big swing because he can there's a lot he can get up to with those 2 Walking Ballistas.
Yeah, Virtuous Gearhulk effectively just a burn spell when you've got Walking Ballista in play.
And a second Virtuous Gearhulk, not really what Victor Fernando Silva was looking for.
Yeah, 5 mana, kind of the high watermark for a lot of these decks in Standard for what they're looking to cast. At the moment, just the 2 Walking Ballistas, which are just barely walking, 1 counter apiece. Hayne's Vehicles deck yet to play a vehicle, but it doesn't seem to have hurt him too much. Gideon on board means that he's just able to go wide.
Yeah, and at some point Gideon could be cashed in for an emblem. Victor can prevent that, or could have prevented that, by shooting Gideon down one with one of the Walking Ballistas, but he predicted that Hayne wouldn't be using the emblem this turn anyway.
Okay.
Well, it looks like he's going to be attacking with Gideon Ally of Zendikar. Big swings coming in here, 9 points threatened by the various attackers of Alex Hayne.
And here's where Walking Ballista gets a little less efficient. If you're just paying 4 mana to put a ++1 counter on it, that's not something that's all that exciting. You really want Winding Constrictor in play, or you want it to be, actively shooting down 1 toughness creatures, not facing down a 5/5 and a bunch of 2/2s.
Well, I guess that at least if one of these Walking Ballistas goes to the graveyard at this point, we are going to have Delirium for the black-green deck. It may be able to start piecing something together, but that's cold comfort in the face of all these attackers.
Yeah, the biggest Delirium payoff here is Traverse the Ulvenwald, or which Victor's already used both of his, or Grim Flare, which as a 4/4, still not really going to get him out of this hole.
All right, so we see a block here, and the Walking Ballista that's not blocking gets a +1/+1 counter.
Sure.
What sort of answers does the black-green deck have for once it's behind on the board to sort of level things up?
Virtuous Gearhulk plus Walking Ballista is a big swing because you end up with like a 5/5 Walking Ballista, which can then do something like attack and then shoot down multiple creatures. But that's probably the biggest answer. Now that Ishkana is no longer a commonly played card.
Go ahead.
Heart of Kiran coming down here. That one that can be crewed by Gideon if needed, but there's plenty of other creatures in play here. Now, it looks on the face of things here like Alex Hayne's deck doesn't have so many 3-power creatures to work with. Is that a big consideration for Heart of Kiran decks?
Oh, well, the combination of Scrap Heap Scrounger and Toolcraft Exemplar and Veteran Motorist does go a long way. And then Gideon actually can pinch hit too, because you can remove a loyalty counter from Gideon. So Heart of Kiran, very effective in these decks. It's one of the reasons that most of the decks are just playing 4, despite it being legendary.
The effective 2-mana Serra Angel, I've heard it described as, can potentially be getting in on attacks and blocks here. Not that there's too much to worry about from attackers right now from Victor Fernando Silva's deck.
Sure.
The Brazilian really, you can see from that advantage bar, in addition to the life totals, in a rough spot here.
Plus creature.
So it goes to 6.
Sorry?
6 counters now.
-1 to
Oh, sure.
yeah. Attacks.
Kind of cool that with Heart of Kiran in play, Planeswalkers get to do double duty, and you can also use loyalty counters on your opponent's turn, when that's the first time that's been the case.
Yeah, with the Vigilance really being relevant in that case, though, I don't think Victor Fernando Silva is making very many more attacks this game.
He has got a Grasp of Darkness in hand and points it directly at that vehicle.
Sure.
Still taking some pretty sizable hits here, though.
You go to 3.
Well, we've got an update from one of our back tables. Martin Dang on Jeskai Control has won his first game against Jonathan Morowski, who is also on the black-green Constrictor deck. It looks like Team Snake having kind of a tricky time here in the feature match area.
Drawing that 5th land is very big for Victor. If Hayne doesn't have an answer here, then Victor can go Virtuous Gearhulk, make my Walking Ballista a 5/5, attack and just kill Gideon with Walking Ballista, and then he has a 5/5 Walking Ballista and a Virtuous Gearhulk, which does actually beat Hayne's forces here. So if Hayne doesn't have a card like Unlicensed Disintegration or Metallic Rebuke, then Victor might have evened the game up.
And we know that there's a second copy of Virtuous Gearhulk in hand, so this is basically the only turn that Alexander Hayne had to answer things there.
Yeah, but he did have the Unlicensed Disintegration, and that will send them on to a game 2.
Yeah, of course. Even if it hadn't been that his opponent was at 3 life, Hayne would have been pretty happy simply to deal with the Walking Ballista. As things stand, though, he does pick up the first win in that game, and we can see that there's also a bit of shuffling going on elsewhere. We'll be able to bring you more Magic soon enough, but first, these messages.
Looking for a place to try out new decks and strategies? Head to your local game store and check out Friday Night Magic. Get more info at wizards.com/FNM.
Hello and welcome back to this round 6 at Pro Tour Aether Revolt. We've just had a chance to see game 1 between Alexander Hayne and Victor Fernando Silva. Hayne of Team Face to Face Games picking up that first game with Mardu vehicles. The Black-Green Constrictor deck of Victor Fernando Silva. Crucially, not seeing any Winding Constrictors in game 1. Can't help but think that that would have been a big game changer for him. Perhaps we'll get a chance to see some more of the Snake in game 2 as these players shuffle up. Now, after game 1, of course, they do get to go to their sideboards. A couple of big changes that can be made in these sideboards. What's the real highlights for you, Luis?
As we've seen before, decks like Victor Fernando Silva's get to board in more efficient removal, get to board in potentially cards like Flaying Tendrils, Natural Obsolescence, Kalidas if he so desires, and that just means that he's going to end up a little bit more well equipped to deal with cards like Heart of Kiran.
One card that I'm kind of interested to see how much changes there are on Alexander Hayne's side is Fatal Push. We know that it's great against a lot of the low drops in Fernando Silva's deck, but we saw Martin User deploying big 5 drops, and that one thing that Fatal Push can't deal with.
Being able to kill Grim Flare or Winding Constrictor or Walking Ballista, even without Revolt, is critical. So Fatal Push does seem like it could be a good option.
All right, these players just studying their opening hands. We'll get able to get things kicked off, and there we have a Hissing Quagmire coming from Victor Fernando Silva. This first land, kind of important for the Mardu Vehicles deck. We saw John Finkel struggling with just access to red and blue early on, because blue not really the main color, and Grim Flare coming down from Fernando Silva. That one of the many powerful black-green 2-drops. I think in the history of the game, creatures that cost exactly black-green tend to be very powerful.
Well, certainly Winding Constrictor and Grim Flare are putting in some work here. Putrid Leech being another old favorite.
Scrap Heap Scrounger there coming down from Alexander Hayne. The 3-2 that keeps on coming back, and with a Spire of Industry, black mana will potentially be available for Alexander Hayne as long as he can make sure he can keep artifacts in play. Big turn 3 play here though for Victor Fernando Silva. This is what his deck wants to do if it's curving out. Rishkar Pima Renegade puts a +1/+1 counter on both of his creatures. That means an attack for 3 from Fernando Silva. Gets through, gets to activate that or trigger that Grim Flare ability. So looking at the top 3 cards of his deck, some of them may go into the graveyard, but one way or another, he's either getting Delirium more easily or he's making sure he draws really good cards.
Yeah, and this is exactly the curve you want. Any 2-drop into Rishkar is a really hard start to deal with, especially since Hayne's 2-drop, the Scrap Heap Scrounger, can't block, so it's a purely aggressive play, and that just puts Hayne in a really tough spot.
It's interesting that some of the most potent cards in Aether Revolt, Heart of Kiran, Rishkar, are legendary. How careful do you need to be when you're building a deck in terms of playing a full 4 of them?
I think a lot of these decks can play 3 or 4 of those cards without much harm, just because they're so powerful and they impact the game so much that even if the opponent leaves it in play, you're pretty happy because it's doing its job, and if they kill it, you just have a backup copy. So I think that seeing 4 Heart of Kiran in all the Mardu Vehicles decks makes a lot of sense.
Well, looking at Victor Fernando Silva's hand, he does have another legend in hand. He did bring in that Kalitas Traitor of Get, and it could be very good against Scrap Heap Scrounger in play, but Unlicensed Disintegration, dealing with Rishkar, leaving just 1/+1/+1 counter around from the legendary Elf Druid.
And this is where Spire of Industry really helps kind of make Hayne's mana base work. That Scrap Heap Scrounger is powering up the Spire of Industry, so that does help. One thing I'd be concerned with Fire Hayne is that Victor Fernando Silva chose not to put any cards in his graveyard when he hit with Grim Flare, so his next 3 draws are all high quality, which not a good sign. When your opponent scries every card at the top, essentially, you're not a fan of that.
And we've talked about how some of these decks can struggle to find untapped lands. It looks like Victor Fernando Silva is not in that spot right now. He does have a Swamp in hand, so he's going to be able to play a 4-drop on curve if he so chooses. Just getting in another hit there with Grim Flare first, though, figuring out what he wants to do in subsequent turns.
Well, the upside to Victor Fernando Silva leaving 3 cards on top the first hit is that he sees 2 of those cards again, so he's not getting as much value from the Grim Flare trigger as he could, just because if he keeps leaving the same cards on top. The downside is those cards are going to be good. So I think Victor Fernando Silva is pretty happy with his board position now.
We see 2 copies of a sideboard card on top of Victor's deck here. 2 copies of Blossoming Defense. Now, +2/+2 on its own doesn't look that special. How important is granting hexproof in this kind of a matchup?
Well, it stops unlicensed disintegration is really the main effect it has, and especially if you expect Hayne to board in more removal spells, it might be that Victor wants to set up Kalitas plus Blossom Defense maybe on turn 5. Though it is worth noting that Victor has access to 4 of them. I'm not sure how many he has because he had 2 in the main and 2 in the board, and he may have brought in more copies if he thinks that removal is a big component to the mirror match, or rather the aggressive mirror match.
Kalitas, Traitor of Get, a lot of abilities on there, the first of which, Lifelink, pretty important in a race. But on top of that, it means that if creatures are dying on the other side of the battlefield, they're getting exiled instead, you're getting 2/2 zombies, and more creatures on the board and less Scrap Heap Scroungers in the graveyard, not a bad spot. Chandra, Torture Defiance has something to say about that, though, killing off the big legend before it gets a chance to do a whole lot.
The good thing for Victor is that even though Chandra did kill off the Kalitas, Victor is still basically ahead a turn here because his Grimflayer is a little bit more effective than Scrap Heap Scrounger, and he gets to spend all his mana this turn. So as long as he has good follow-up, which presumably he does by leaving all those cards on top, then he should be still in pretty good shape here.
Well, Team Snake, we've seen it. Here is a Winding Constrictor in play. Chandra, Torture Defiance being taken down, and then we have a Natural Obsolescence to put Scrap Heap Scrounger on the bottom of Alexander Hayne's deck. That the perfect answer to Scrap Heap Scrounger, because we're not likely to see that at any point for the rest of the game now.
Yeah, it is a very good way of dealing with that. Also hits Heart of Kiran if that ends up being a problem, or something like Cultivator's Caravan, which these decks do play.
So we see the advantage bar kind of pointing on the Brazilian side of things. Victor Fernando Silva, he's had a nice couple of turns here. And Alexander Hayne on the back foot. What's he really need to do to get back in this game, Luis?
He needs a couple turns where he plays 2 things in the same turn, because that's part of how Victor has gotten ahead here in this last turn, is he was able to play 2 powerful 2-mana spells and put himself firmly ahead as a result.
Well, 2 spells in 1 turn achieved. Cultivator's Caravan and a Heart of Kiran, 2 big vehicles, one of which, of course, also helps fix Alexander Hayne's mana quite a bit here. There you see the Cultivator's Caravan. Crew 3, it becomes a 5/5, but even if you can't crew it, it's going to give you 1 mana of any color.
So that was a good turn because Hayne got to deploy 2 things, but given they both have a crew 3 cost, it's going to be hard for Hayne to crew them both in the same turn, unless he has something like Gideon that can crew Heart off loyalty counters. So he's got a ways to go, because that, while it sets him up for next turn, this turn it doesn't help defend him. He's going to get hit by the Grimflayer and the Winding Constrictor, and even though Grimflayer doesn't quite have Delirium yet, it's going to get there soon.
Yeah, one thing that I've learned from Modern is, and indeed Standard, is that Grimflayer hitting on multiple turns is not something that you want to let happen in a perfect world. It looks like there's a Verdurous Gearhulk is a new card for Victor Fernando Silva to consider here. And a couple of cards going to the graveyard here. I believe that we may now have Delirium. We've got a sorcery, we've got an artifact, we've got a creature and an instant. So now that Grimflayer will be hitting for, well, it's coming in for 5 now. Fatal Push also going to the graveyard. What's our follow-up play here from Fernando Silva? There's a Tireless Tracker. No land to follow up to immediately make a clue, but it's something that is certainly another one of a suite of potent green cards for him here.
And now Victor has 3 pretty big threats. The Tireless Tracker and the Grimflayer are much bigger threats than the Winding Constrictor on the current board, but there's a lot of cards Victor could play that make Winding Constrictor very, very threatening. Another Rishkar, a Verdurous Gearhulk, a Walking Ballista. So even if Hayne can deal with the other 2 threats, he's in a bit of trouble. So Hayne is quite far behind here and needs, again, multiple spells in order to catch up.
Well, Gideon can sometimes feel like multiples. The Planeswalker can immediately churn out creature tokens, though at 2/2 they're not quite big enough on their own to crew any vehicles here. He's going to use a little bit of his Planeswalker loyalty to crew Heart of Kiran. And that means that Fatal Push is now able to target the legendary vehicle. This is one of the reasons that Fatal Push is so great.
Yeah, dealing with a 4/4 is well above expectation for a 1-mana removal spell, and it turns out the efficiency of Heart of Kiran can be a drawback when it comes to Fatal Push. So Fatal Push very good against the Mardu Vehicles deck.
PNLR coming along, bringing a Thopter token in addition to the Night Ally token coming from Gideon. So Alexander Hayne has been able to make his board pretty wide here. Let's see whether or not that's going to be enough. He's on just 7 life, and it looks like Victor Fernando Silva may be able to square things up at a game of peace.
And having 2 copies, it looks like a Blossom Defense in hand, combined with Grimflayer being a 5/5 trample, means that Victor has a lot of good attacks here, and he can actually potentially bypass Gideon and just go straight to Alexander Hayne's face, because he's threatening lethal, and especially given that he's got multiple pump spells in hand, it's easy for Hayne to block in such a way that he just dies to the Grimfire.
Hayne tapped out, so not too much for Victor Fernando Silva to worry about here. Swings for the fences. And the Platinum Pro, member of Team Face-to-Face Games, staring down. What he may not fully appreciate is a lethal attack.
Well, I think if you're Hayne and you can't beat anything, you put the Knight on the Tireless Tracker, you double block the Winding Constrictor, you just hope that Victor just has nothing, which unfortunately for Alexander is not the case.
And that enough to close things out. It is now 1-1 in our main match between Victor Fernando Silva and Alexander Hayne. We have got a little bit more magic going on in the feature match area. A smiling Martin Dang just walking away from the feature match area. But on our back table, we do still have some more magic going on between Ben Rubin, 5-0 on Black-Green Delirium, and Kelvin Chu from MTG Mint Card on Mardu Vehicles. So there's Kelvin. We can see him, one of Team MTG Mint Card. His opponent, he is on Team D3 Go. One of two teams that have been working together, Team Puzzle Quest and Team D3 Go. Two of the most powerful teams at this Pro Tour.
Though MTG Mint Card and their counterpart MTG Bent Card actually had the best records after the draft portion of the event, with 14-4 and 13-5 records respectively.
So we're fairly familiar with many of the cards in this matchup because in some respects our front table is similar, but it's worth noting that Ben Rubin's deck is being described as Black-Green Delirium. It's not so heavily reliant on any snakes. Kicking off with a lot of good cards, though, on the other side of things. Kelvin Chu getting Thraben Inspector into that Scrap Heat Scrounger, so he's got plenty of power on the board early on. Sylvan Advocate in hand for Ben Rubin. That a card that we don't necessarily see in the Winding Constrictor decks, but it's hard to argue with it. It's still that solid 2-3 vigilance that can potentially grow even larger once you get lots of lands at play.
Ben Rubin's theme is 2/3s for 2. He's got Winding Constrictor, Sylvan Advocate, and Gifted Aetherborn. So he's got as many 2/3s for 2 as you can put in a deck.
Gifted Aetherborn, sometimes referred to as Vampire Nightwalk. Lifelink and Death Touch, a powerful combination, but Fatal Push means that Kelvin Chu able to push through damage here, getting 4 on Ben Rubin, dropping him to 15. He does need to get the damage in early because Ben Rubin, he's already a game up, just looking to close things out. Each of these players on 5-0 looking to keep that streak alive. Looks like there is a Winding Constrictor in hand for Ben Rubin. But Grimflare the play here for him.
Still a ways away from Delirium, but Grimflare does set him up to attack next turn, and he has noticed that Kelvin didn't make a land drop on turn 3, so it's possible that Kelvin's hand is not going to be able to deploy too many more threats.
Well, push after push means that pushing through damage for Kelvin Chu getting fairly straightforward. Ben Rubin taking another hit of 4 there. Yes, he gets to activate Evolving Wilds, but all that's doing for him in this case is simply getting lands into play. There are other occasions where, you know, it helps you with Delirium, or perhaps it helps you with a Tireless Tracker. Right now, though, it just helps him cast his spells.
Kind of cool feature of Ben Rubin's deck is he's got 3 Botanical Sanctum and 4 Evolving Wilds in the main deck. Botanical Sanctum being the blue-green land, and then 1 island in the sideboard to power up Metallic Rebuke. So a pretty cool counterspell sideboard plan out of the black-green deck.
Yeah, I'm loving the way that Metallic Rebuke is the most surprising counterspell in recent memory, really. The fact that it only requires a single blue mana and that artifacts can help power it up means that any number of decks seem to have the option of having access to a bit of counter magic these days.
Well, the one thing that Kelvin Chu does have going for him is that even when push comes to shove, he's only got 2 mana, but he's got a bunch of 1 and 2 mana spells, so he's able to really deal with Ben's threats despite being a little choked on mana.
We see another natural obsolescence there. We said about what a great answer it is to Scrap Heap Scrounger in our last game, and it remains true. Winding Constrictor, the follow-up play, and Kelvin Chu, at some point he's going to have to draw a 3rd land. At the moment his removal has been good enough, but now Winding Constrictor, well and truly the biggest creature on the battlefield. Kelvin Chu, basically a mono Fatal Push deck at this point. At some point that plan's going to stop working for him.
Well, unfortunately he's only pushing through 1 damage a turn now with that Thraben Inspector, so despite being able to kill a lot of Ben's cards, he's really not getting there in terms of getting his threats on board.
Yeah, if he thinks that fatal push is fatal, at this point he's pushing his luck. Another Winding Constrictor in hand here for Ben Rubin. 1 mana off Verdurous Gearhulk, so definitely a temptation to get the Snake in play. And with Traverse the Elvenwald, he will be able to find a 5th land.
Yeah, it's always unfortunate when you have to use Traverse to hit your 5th land when you would have Delirium fairly shortly thereafter, and a 6th land doesn't do much for you, but Ben really does want to make sure he gets to play the Verdurous Gearhulk next turn.
Picks up another Swamp here. Lots of black mana available to Ben Rubin. Just the Winding Constrictor, but conspicuously holding up black here. There are definitely some powerful instants that have that sort of a cost in Standard.
So Kelvin has hit his 3rd land here with the Aether Hub, which luckily for him, the Mardu Vehicles deck really tops out pretty close to 3, though. I think he's got the 4th Fatal Push in hand.
No one expects the 4th one, right? And in this case, Unlicensed Disintegration, a more efficient removal spell for him, though he doesn't know that there may be a 5-drop coming next turn.
That Thraben Inspector is doing some work.
Yeah, Ben Rubin on just 6 life. It's not going to take too much to close things out here. The 3 points of damage from Unlicensed Disintegration, a big feature. Sometimes it kills Planeswalkers, but sometimes it just kills opponents. And Ben Rubin playing a gigantic Verdurous Gearhulk.
Okay.
This is an interesting removal spell that we don't see necessarily quite so much of. Skywhaler's Shot, dealing with a creature with power 4 or greater. Verdurous Gearhulk definitely qualifying. And a scry here from Kelvin Chu as he looks to try and find a way of getting just those last points of damage in and forcing a game 3.
Yeah, looks like Kelvin Chu has a very removal-heavy Mardu deck with 4 Fatal Push, Skywhaler's Shot, and Unlicensed Disintegration. Especially once you post board, he's just shifted into a deck that's just looking to kill all of Ben's creatures.
And Ben Rubin does have Rishkar Puma Renegade here. Rishkar on his own is not going to be able to pump too much. Let's see if he can string something together.
Well, the good thing for Ben is that Kelvin still just has that one lone Thraben Inspector. He's got more threats in hand, but he doesn't have them in play right now, so Ben does have a little bit of breathing room, because Thraben Inspector could hit Ben for a couple more turns, and it would not finish things off.
Rubin also has a Ruinous Path in play. I guess he's kind of hoping for something a bit bigger and more exciting to kill off, though. At some point, he may have to pull the trigger on it here. Step 1, let's make a 3-3 for 3. And another Traverse the Elvenwald.
This time Ben does have Delirium, so he gets to search up something pretty good and defensive.
Yeah, this one of the cards that's the reason that we're referring to this list as Black-Green Delirium rather than simply a Winding Constrictor deck. You do not see Ishkanar Graf Widow in all of the Black-Green decks that we see in the Pro Tour here.
In fact, Ben just has the one after sight, so we're not running out of spider tokens quite as often as we used to.
Nonetheless, BDM is lurking around the feature match area, a keen spider aficionado. Cultivates Caravan, one of the pickups for Kelvin Chu here, so if he wants to develop his mana, he has the option.
And so even though Kelvin Chu is an aggressive deck, the Mardu Vehicles deck, besides Unlicensed Disintegration, doesn't really have any burn spells. So Ben Rubin at 5 life, if he can lock up the board, is probably not going to die to a flurry of burn, because it just really requires multiple copies of Unlicensed Disintegration. And that puts Ben in a pretty good spot, because Ishkanar does such a good job of blocking and making it very hard for Ben to get attacked.
Yeah, I mean, this exactly the place where our advantage bar really comes into play and makes it clear that it's not just all about life totals. Ben Rubin able to assemble a board that, in spite of the fact that he's substantially lower on life than his opponent, is not a big deal. Many spiders in play for Ben Rubin here. It's going to be tough for Kelvin Chu to get in these last few points. The first ones came easy. These last ones, though, he's going to have to work for. Heart of Kiran in hand for Kelvin Chu. Much of the time, the green-black decks don't have much defense against flyers, but every one of these spiders does have reach, so it may prove an expensive one to crew. Starts off with Scrap Heap Scrounger, leaves some mana up. Scrap Heap Scrounger has the magic 3 power to crew so many of the vehicles in the Mardu vehicles deck. And Cultivator's Caravan coming in will prompt, this is a lethal attack, will prompt some blocks from Ben Rubin.
So Ben does have the option of essentially trading Ishkana or 2 spiders for the Caravan. He could block with Ishkana and all the spiders. And then Kelvin then has the decision either kill the 3/5 or kill 2 of the 1/2s. So he gets to do that, whether he wants to clear more blockers or clear the higher power and toughness out by killing Ishkana. He's got to start somewhere. It always feels like such a grind to get through Ishkana and her entire brood, but Cultivator's Caravan does give him a good start.
Goes for the legendary spider. Is there any consideration to Ishkana's activated ability in this sort of matchup?
It's not a big consideration. It does come up sometimes. You certainly can finish the game that way, but given the current life totals and the current board position, I don't think that either player is particularly concerned with it.
Heart of Kiran, the follow-up there for Kelvin Chu, effectively using his mana, and it's been impressive considering how constrained he's been on mana every turn, how he's been able to use almost all of it. He's had a clue in play for a long time now, and never just had spare mana lying around to crack it.
Another interesting feature here is that even though Ben does have a removal spell in Ruinous Path, he's got no good targets for it. He can't kill Heart of Kiran unless Kelvin activates it on Ben's turn, and killing Scrap Heap Scrounger is temporary at best.
Ruinous Path does get played on the Scrap Heap Scrounger here.
Go.
The Awaken cost on it, possibly a little ambitious for this game, but relevant in others. Another Heart of Kiran in hand for Kelvin Chu, so this is the dark side of having legendary creatures in your deck. Cracks a clue. Toolcraft Exemplar, the pickup there. Conveniently, during combat, does get big enough to crew that Heart of Kiran, which attacks.
It's gonna play the job of bug exterminator, as a spider has to get thrown under the Heart of Kiran every single turn, or Ben is gonna fall to 1.
Evolving Wilds fetching out a land here for Ben Rubin at the end of turn. Ben Rubin has slowly but surely been running out of cards in hand in these last few turns, and is kind of living off the top of his deck here. So deck thinning, not irrelevant. I can't imagine that he desperately needs more mana in play just from a straightforward casting his spell standpoint. Though he does have, is that 2 copies of Hissing Quagmire there? I believe so.
It is, and he could potentially draw a Ruinous Path, which also would reward him for having a lot of lands in play and untapped. In fact, he could have awakened it last turn if he chose to use Rishkar instead of attacking with Rishkar. But I think that Heart of Kiran has gotten Kelvin fairly well back into the game, though. At this point, Ben can start attacking with Hissing Quagmires if he wants to go on the offensive.
Rubin carefully weighing up his options here.
Those spiders do buy Ben a lot of time, so he's got a couple turns left where he chumps Heart of Kiran. He could attack for potentially 5. Could even attack, well, he doesn't really want to attack with the spiders into a Thraben Inspector. So if he attacks with Rishkar and Hissing Quagmire, drops Kelvin to 9, and then on the backswing chumps the Heart of Kiran. One risk is that if Kelvin plays another creature to crew the Heart with, then Toolcraft Exemplar could potentially attack as well.
If we assume that both of these players have a kind of relatively even position on board, obviously Kelvin with the advantage in life, which of these decks top decks better in terms of breaking any kind of a stall?
Ben's deck has the more powerful cards to draw, and especially since Heart of Kiran is legendary, Kelvin's already drawn a second. That's one of Kelvin's better cards, but just drawing additional copies right here is not really relevant. Gifted Aetherborn is quite relevant, however. That's going to give Ben a little bit of life to play with and a much better attacker. The 2/3 Death Touch lifelink just does a lot on the board.
Yeah, I guess it doesn't take too many hits before Heart of Kiran's clock takes a little bit longer, and Heart of Kiran still has 1 more spider to get through before it can actually do any damage to Ben Rubin's life total. He picks up another card for a turn. It is a spell. And the Gifted Aetherborn front and center now for Ben Rubin. A lot of Death Touch available to Ben Rubin's deck, so attacks on the ground not particularly exciting to block for Kelvin Chu here.
And Ben has to decide how much he wants to overextend here, because Cultivator's Caravan could threaten an attack next turn, depending on what Kelvin plays as a vehicle. Also, if Thraben Inspector gets a chance to chump block, then Kelvin can chump block something like Rishkar with Thraben Inspector. End of turn, bring back Scrap Heap Scrounger, because it does get another creature into the graveyard. And then all of a sudden, both Heart of Kiran and Cultivator's Caravan could be attacking next turn.
Yeah, there's a lot of sort of explosive potential from the Mardu Vehicles deck. The explosions from the black-green side of things often involve putting lots of counters on creatures already in play. So a couple of swings here coming from Kelvin Chu, and that Thraben Inspector does jump under a Rishkar-shaped bus. But the life total's now 7-7 thanks to the lifelink of Gifted Aetherborn, and Ben Rubin passes things back. Step 1, Scrap Heap Scrounger comes back, and a big draw step here for Kelvin Chu. What does he find? It is a land, that a critical moment that he could have potentially got out of jail here.
So now Kelvin can certainly attack with the Heart of Kiran and then leave, if he wants, the option of blocking with either Cultivator's Caravan or a Heart of Kiran, depending on which one he wants to crew. But that still puts him somewhat behind, especially if Ben has anything else. And those Hissing Quagmires are really coming into action here.
Toolcraft Exemplar, again, able to, just when we get to combat, can crew pretty much everything. Heart of Kiran getting stuck in with Vigilance in the air, just one creature able to block that, that being the Spider token. And Ben Rubin, a little furrow in his brow, just figuring out what he might have to play around. 2 cards in Kelvin Chu's hand.
So one thing to think of for Ben is, if Kelvin had Unlicensed Disintegration, Ben would potentially be dead already. So blocking there isn't necessary, but on the other hand, if Ben has an answer, then that actually works out quite nicely.
So natural obsolescence, meaning that for the briefest of moments there was no Heart of Kiran on the board, and now Ben Rubin gets an answer to what one of those cards was that's been held by Kelvin Chu for a number of turns. A second copy of Heart of Kiran immediately being cast after combat. Kelvin Chu passes things back, and again, each player looking to the top of their deck, seeing what they can muster.
So now, Ben, if he attacks with Gifted Aetherborn, it can trade for anything that gets crewed and blocks it, but Ben at this point is still facing down multiple vehicles, potentially, depending on how Kelvin chooses to block. Though I think that Ben drawing a spell that just killed a duplicate legendary wasn't actually great for Ben. Kelvin was happy with that exchange. Despite not getting in damage that turn, he got to trade a card that wasn't doing anything for Ben's draw step.
Now we get to find out what the next spell is from Ben Rubin. Looks like he's got some mana to work with, kicking things off by activating Hissing Quagmire.
Yeah, it looks like Ben's going to follow this up with a Grim Flare, which, yeah, relevant body on the board, certainly.
2/2/3 Death Touchers coming through.
And so one of the reasons that Kelvin would crew with the Toolcraft Exemplar instead of Scrap Heap Scrounger, which of course can't block, is that on Ben's turn, Scrap Heap Scrounger can still crew either of Kelvin's vehicles, whereas the Toolcraft Exemplar shrinks back down to a 1/1. So now this gives Kelvin the option of blocking with either vehicle.
Looks like Heart of Kiran's the choice. Ben Rubin does get to gain some life from his Gifted Aetherborn as it's on his way out. Deals 2 damage with Hissing Quagmire. That meaning the life total's now 5-9. Ben Rubin, he's a game up already and has been able to turn things around here after taking some hits early on, powered up by a lot of copies of Fatal Push from Kelvin Chu. Rishkar Pima Renegade, meaning that there's actually 2 mana available for Ben Rubin, though without cards in hand, not too much for Kelvin to worry about. Veteran Motorist here allowing 2 scries, and when you're in top deck mode, scries almost as good as drawing cards.
It certainly gets you a long way towards the cards that you're looking for. Unlicensed Disintegration pretty high on the list, though I think Kelvin left another Veteran Motorist on top, which will let him repeat this next turn. But at this point, the board is almost stalled where Cultivator's Caravan keeps back everything but Hissing Quagmire. Ben, again, the deck that tends to top deck a little better, and now he has the life total advantage, but this still could be a very close game depending on what either player draws, because we're in such a state that a good draw from either player could send the game in a completely different direction.
Yeah, fingers poised over that advantage bar at this point. It really could go either way, though looking at things strictly on board, Ben Rubin looking fairly good here. Veteran Motorist, there you see it. When it crews a vehicle, that vehicle gets +1/+1, but in the face of Death Touch from Ben Rubin, +1/+1 not meaning all that much. just the one vehicle in play for Kelvin Chu at the moment, that being a Cultivator's Caravan.
So despite Ben drawing, an additional 2 lands over Kelvin Chu, the 7 lands to 5, those Hissing Quagmires start to trade for cards. So that's one of the advantages of playing lands like, that activate, is that you get to have extra lands without actually getting flooded.
Delirium well and truly active, so the Grimflayer in play for Ben Rubin is a 4/4. Trample, potentially relevant if you can find a way of pumping it further, but right now does not match up especially well with what's going on the other side of the battlefield. Only Hissing Quagmire getting stuck in here. And with Rishkar Pima Renegade, just the right mana to have 1 Hissing Quagmire available on blocks. Veteran Motorist, quick to trade with the first one that gets stuck in, and another copy of it coming from Ben Rubin. Even though it's a land draw, a pretty good one. This time Veteran Motorist sees a land, and I think that might be another Skywhaler shot.
And that can kill Grimflayer or Rishkar. So now Ben actually, the onus is on him to have a good draw step this turn, because otherwise the board stalls out, and Kelvin scrying has really given this aggro deck extra reach in the late game, where he's able to dig to more powerful spells, put lands on the bottom, and even though Ben has more powerful cards in general, Kelvin's drawing fewer lands and fewer dead cards.
Approach from out to the scorekeeper station, please.
Very tight game here. We can see that the advantage on Ben Rubin's side gradually diminishing over these turns as Kelvin Chu strings together a couple of nice draw steps. Definitely room for this to be anybody's game. And just so you know, we will have more Magic after this game. We are holding our match between Victor Fernando Silva and Alexander Hayne on the front table. So our feature match area, plenty still going on. We still get to see more of green-black versus vehicles. It just won't be in the hands of these players. Looks like some decisions to be made here by Ben Rubin.
Ben Rubin's known for being a fairly deliberate player, and he does like to make sure he's sure before he commits to any line of play.
Veteran Motorist, a final act of crewing as it goes on its way out thanks to Fatal Push. No Revolt needed to deal with many of the creatures in the Mardu Vehicles deck. Fairly low to the ground in terms of its costs.
That Cultivator's Caravan is kind of one of the last things standing between Kelvin and Ben's creatures, because Scrapheap Scoundrel can't block, and Toolcraft Exemplar does a very poor job of blocking. So that Fatal Push was a fairly big draw for Ben.
If you're looking for a creature that's not afraid of a Caravan, that is Hissing Quagmire. Getting stuck in here, Kelvin Chu looks like he's taking it, going down to just 3 points of life here. And Ben Rubin knows that there's going to be a pretty solid draw. He's seen the scrying that's been going on from Kelvin Chu, thanks to all of those Veteran Motorists. Kelvin Chu doesn't even need to look at the card that he's drawn initially, just puts it down with the rest of his hand.
He does know, in fact, know what it is. He can take a shot at guessing it, and that does help. And those Hissing Quagmires are still coming after Kelvin, though.
Ben Rubin, step one, let's figure out what we're doing with the board. Well, Traverse the Elven World at this stage of the game has to be a fantastic draw. There you can see the advantage bar immediately moving. Delirium very much active, and Walking Ballista with all of these lands in play, a big deal, able to simply make a bunch of +1/+1 counters and go straight to the head. Rishkar doesn't even need to be tapped for this to be 3 +1/+1 counters. We're going to find the right dice, but I'm guessing it's not going to stay on the Walking Ballista for all too long here. There is the handshake. Kelvin Chu knows when he's beaten. Ben Rubin winning 2-0 and advancing to 6-0 in this tournament. A fantastic start for the D3 Go member. Of course, Kelvin Chu from MTG Mint card at 5-1 certainly can't be unhappy where he is at this stage in the tournament. And we get a little bit more magic back in our main match between, on the left-hand side, we've got Victor Fernando Silva, and he's up against Alexander Hayne. There we see Fernando Silva of Brazil. He is on the Black-Green Constrictor deck, so not quite as higher top end as what we saw from Ben Rubin, but a lot of similarities there. Meanwhile, Pretty low to the ground aggression on the other side of things from Alexander Hayne, kicking things off with a Thraben Inspector, bringing a clue alongside it.
Attack.
At some point that clue may mean drawing a card, but just being an artifact in play, relevant for a lot of what is going on for Hayne's deck. He kicks off turn 2 with a Veteran Motorist, gets to scry and sees some land here. Looks like there's already land in hand for Hayne, so at least some of those 2 cards going to the bottom of his deck. To Fernando Silva. First turn didn't have much to do, just fixing his mana base, but we know that there are lots of potent 2-drops from this deck.
Yeah, and Victor's going to need to have one. If he doesn't have a 2-drop here, he's in a lot of trouble. But like you said, the deck has a lot of 2-drops it has access to, so I'd be surprised if he didn't have a play here.
Yeah, I can see there we have a Winding Constrictor, and there's a Grasp of Darkness along with 2 copies of Fatal Push. So plenty going on for Silva in terms of what he wants to do, and he picked up a Walking Ballista, which is a fantastic play right after you've got a Winding Constrictor in play.
Hayne still is firing on all cylinders here, as vehicle decks tend to do. He gets to, his option of Fatal Pushing Winding Constrictor, hitting for 4, and playing a Scrap Heap Scrounger, leaving him with 3 creatures in play against Victor's 0. And being on the play plus having a relevant 1-drop, plus a 1-drop and a 2-drop on turn 3, I mean, that is how you get ahead here.
Yeah, this is curving out at its best, folks. First off, removing the creature, then getting a Scrap Heap Scrounger in play. Another Walking Ballista, I think, the pickup there for Fernando Silva. And while it is a very, very powerful Magic card, it's a little bit slow on this kind of a board.
It does get to block Scrap Heap Scrounger and pick off the Veteran Motorist, so it does buy Victor a turn and trade 1-for-1, which is a pretty nice for just 2 mana, but I think Hayne is still not unhappy about his board position here.
Yeah, looking at that advantage bar, Hayne very much in control of things as they stand right now. We see exactly the blocks that you lined up there. So not taking too much this turn, Victor Fernando Silva, but what does Alexander Hayne have as follow-up? I mean, cracking a clue has to be a good sign for the Brazilian here. Didn't want to see too many spells coming from the other side of things.
No, and Hayne really, that was the turn where if Hayne had played like a Heart of Kiran or a Cultivator's Caravan, he would be, or a Gideon would have been amazing. So he had a lot of an opportunity to get really far ahead here, and cracking a clue and playing another Thraben Inspector doesn't utilize it quite as much.
So Silva passing back here, which may seem a little bit suspicious. We know that he has some removal in hand. It's just going to be a matter of what to deploy it on. Scrap Heap Scrounger is not exciting to kill off, and neither is Thraben Inspector here.
Yeah, this is a good turn for Hayne. No matter what gets killed by Grasp, Hayne is not unhappy about that.
So a couple more points. Victor Fernando Silva dropping to 12 and really needs to find some land here. While his deck has got potent low drops, at some point when Hayne just casts multiple spells, or indeed a Chandra, this could be the death knell.
Yeah. How Planeswalkers tend to work is that if you're ahead and you play a Planeswalker, then it tends to snowball very quickly. It tends to each turn get you more and more ahead. And the fact that Victor is playing 1 spell a turn here really does not bode well for him when Hayne is so far ahead on board.
Yeah, having to use a Traverse and traverse the Elven to find a land. Obviously better than simply not finding a land, but only by a little bit. I mean, we've got Alexander Hayne threatening a lot of damage coming through in the next few turns, and he's going to be getting value off Chandra, Torture Defiance on every single one of them. How's the black-green deck actually dealing with Planeswalkers? It's basically got Walking Ballista that seems good. Is there much else?
Some of them play Ruinous Path. Victor has 2 in his main deck. He may not have kept them in. But in general, it is attacking with Verdurous Gearhook and Walking Ballista, though Ruinous Path can solve them if you really need to.
It's going to need to be something fairly good from Victor Fernando Silva, probably on this next couple of turns if he's going to get back in this one. This is not a problem that he can solve just with a single good turn, I wouldn't imagine at this point. Chandra ticking up, and an Unlicensed Disintegration doesn't have a great target here.
Because people are asking about it, Victor had Delirium with Traverse the Ulvenwald, so he was able to get a Blooming Marsh, which he elected to do, since once you have Delirium, you can actually get non-basic lands. So, thanks to having artifact, creature, land, and instant in his graveyard.
Of course, if you do have queries, let us know in the chat. We'll help where we can. big swings coming in here. Activating of a land, and that the one that's going to get killed off with Fatal Push here. Throw-in Inspector's not big, but they are getting in damage, so actually warranting even more removal from the Brazilian. In spite of this, he drops to 7, and after all of that work, there's still a Chandra on the board, and at 6 loyalty, she is a scary threat indeed.
I feel like anytime you're forced to Fatal Push Thraben Inspector, you're conceding some kind of advantage. That is not the optimal use of that card. Not that Victor had a choice, because he's so far behind, he just has to cast all his spells, but the Vehicles deck is really punishing Victor here for not having good blockers.
Yeah, Grimflayer in play for now. We'll see whether or not there's much that Alexander Hayne has to say about that, but even if he just simply attacks around it, draws a clue here. Draws with a clue, sorry. And Heart of Kiran, a potent draw, because not too much that the deck's going to be able to do in terms of blocking flyers. There is, of course, removal available, but in the meantime, Chandra herself gets to remove the one blocker, or indeed not, thanks to Blossoming Defense from Victor Fernando Silva. Does this brick wall the whole turn for Alexander Hayne?
Yeah, Hayne is not going to be able to attack that turn, so that was a pretty substantial swing, because having a 4/4 Grim player in play does give Hayne a little bit of pause. He can't attack that turn, and it's possible that Victor can set up a good attack next turn, especially if he has like another Fatal Push or removal spell for the Heart of Kiran. Though Victor still has an uphill battle from here.
I believe that his hand is a relatively good one. I think I saw a Winding Constrictor and a copy of Walking Ballista in hand. Those two play very, very nicely together, and 4 mana means that both of them can get cast. First up, though, we're going to see Grimflayer getting stuck in, trying to attack Chandra. Heart of Kiran jumping in the way of the Planeswalker. Now, Alexander did have the option of crewing Heart of Kiran with the Planeswalker, but I guess that Scrap Scrounger wasn't going to be doing a whole lot of blocking anyway. 2 counters on Walking Ballista thanks to Winding Constrictor coming down first. And empty-handed Magic now from Victor Fernando Silva. He's living off the top of his deck. A few cards in hand for Alexander Hayne, plus being ahead on the board. Rough times for the Brazilian.
Well, if Hayne doesn't have any action in hand and ends up missing on Chandra, this could be more of a game, but it does not look like that's the case.
Yeah, pretty big hit here on Chandra. Getting more Planeswalkers in play. We've already said that Planeswalker's good if you're ahead.
And Hayne actually has an Unlicensed Disintegration in hand, so he's able to play Gideon plus Unlicensed Disintegration in the same turn. This is going to be very difficult for Victor to come back from.
Multiple members of the Gatewatch staring down the black-green Constrictor deck. Team face-to-face games. Nothing but Platinum. A very, very powerful team at this first of the Pro Tours that is featuring the team competition. And Alexander Hayne at 4-1, looking to go to 5-1 here. Swings in with his Scrap Heap Scrounger. Drops his opponent down to just 4 points of life here. And there is the third land, which means that we have the potential for Unlicensed Disintegration. Makes a Night Ally token. And passes things back here. Now he's seen a Blossoming Defense from Victor Fernando Silva, still quite happy to play Unlicensed Disintegration into it.
Yeah, at this point, Hayne by waiting means that maybe Victor goes for putting another counter Walking Ballista, and you can Unlicensed Disintegration the Winding Constrictor in response. You could Unlicensed Disintegration the Walking Ballista, but it won't end up resolving because it'll remove all the counters, so if you won't end up dealing the actual 3 damage, the creature needs to be there when it resolves, but either way, Hayne is in really good shape here.
Kills off the snake, and that enough for the handshake from Victor Fernando Silva. He would have been taking 3 from Unlicensed Disintegration, and I mean, there was just a huge amount of damage available on the board for Alexander Hayne. A little bit of a smirk there from him as he extends the hand. Another victory for Alexander Hayne, advances to 5-1. You can see there the crowd getting a chance to watch from in the hall. The players just mere feet away from the most direct people watching the game. Of course, also very happy to have you watching at home. Join us in the Twitch chat. If you subscribe, there are some brand new Twitch emotes. If you see a play that you like, hashtag PT Top Plays, take a clip of it, share it, and there's already been a lot of great magic here at Pro Tour, either Revolt. But this is the end of our round. We'll be back soon, but first, these messages.
Welcome back to the news desk. Here we are at the back end of round 6. Great stuff going on out on the floor. One of the developing stories, it's not one of the top teams, it's not a Hall of Famer, it's not Platinum, it's the story of Team Panama, who at the World Magic Cup last year did a tremendous job. They made it so far into the tournament, they got invited back here to Pro Tour Aether Revolt, and one of them, Cesar Segovia, just can't stop winning. 3-0 in draft, already 3-0 in constructed. He is one of 6 or maybe 7 players who currently lead the field as we head down the backstretch of day 1. BDM, this is a fantastic story, and I think, well, you may be able to get some translating help on this one.
Thanks, Rich. I'm here on the floor with 2 members of the Panamanian national team, Saul Alvarado, the captain this year, and Cesar Segovia playing in his first Pro Tour. Cesar, how long have you been waiting to have this opportunity to play on the Pro Tour?
¿Cuánto tiempo has esperado para oportunidad para jugar el Pro Tour?
Oh, comencé a jugar desde el 2003, así que son 13 años.
At 13 years, it started 2003.
Now, you win a World Magic Cup qualifier. You get to go to the World Magic Cup. That was your first big tournament experience. Has that given you a lot of confidence as you play on the stage? You don't seem very phased by some of the big names you played so far. You seem to be just like having fun and playing Magic. Is that how you approach it?
Que si jugar el Magic World Cup te dio esa confianza, que no pareciera que te intimidara ninguno de los nombres con los que has jugado.
Sí, solamente juego porque me gusta, amo ese juego desde que lo conocí y trato de ser mejor cada día.
He doesn't care too much about pros. He plays because he loves it and he's going to keep playing.
Now, I know you're playing a deck that is not the deck the rest of your team is playing. How did you arrive? When did you arrive at your deck for this tournament? When did you decide what you were going to play?
No está jugando y está ahí con nosotros. Está jugando otro tipo de deck. ¿Por qué está jugando ese deck y cuándo llegaste a esa conclusión?
Realmente yo venía con un verde-negro agro, pero simplemente sentí que el deck no me quería y armé ese deck porque me gustaba agresivo, rápido y bueno, simplemente sentí que será.
He brought a black-green aggro deck, but he was not getting the vibe of the deck, so he built something last night, and he's 6-0, right?
Yeah, 6-0 with Rakdos here at Pro Tour Aether Revolt. So you get to cross off another item on your list. 6-0, you're firmly into day 2. What are you hoping to? What do you hope to happen here as you progress through these stages of your Magic career very quickly over the last few months?
Ya tienes un 6-0, estás en el Pro Tour. ¿Cuáles son tus próximas expectativas? ¿Qué piensas hacer?
Continuar jugando Magic y tratar de ganar y jugar más Pro Tour.
Keep playing Magic, try to top 8, and keep playing Magic, win more.
All right, Cesar Segovia, Saul Alvarado, thanks so much for talking to us. Everyone home watching in Panama, 6-0. Maybe we'll get this guy into the feature match area sometime soon. And sending it back to you at the news desk, Rich Hagon.
So I think the summary of how to do well at Magic was 2 parts. 1, win. Part 2, win more. That seems to be the path for Cesar Segovia, at least. What a great story. Well done to Team Panama, and especially the man in the hat, Cesar Segovia, 6-0. Now, by my reckoning, these are the results still coming in. There's see 1 match left we're waiting on. But Cesar Segovia is 6-0. Chen Win of Team Fire Squad is 6-0. Gabor Coxis, the lone Hungarian playing at this event, they have a great World Magic Cup history too. He's a perennial on that team. He's 6-0. From Team China, they had 2 players at 4-0. Yu Chen Liu has gone on to win 2 more in constructed. He's 6-0. And then both Ben Hall of Famers are 6-0. Could we see Ben Rubin against Ben Stark in round 7 to see which one of them can get one step closer to being a lone undefeated player here at Pro Tour Aether Revolt? Well, meanwhile, it's deck tech time here at PT Aether Revolt. We've got Ian Duke waiting for us, and someone who, between you and me, I think is going to be a Hall of Famer really rather soon. It's Josh Utter-Layton.